In this video, we're going to talk about traditional arts of Asia. Starting with India, much of what we know about ancient Indian culture comes from the city of Harappa, which actually shows themes found later in Indian art, such as the sculptures had a sensual naturalism with very soft lines and a realistic human figure. It was not idealized like the West. During the Vedic period, we see the belief in the universe as cyclical emerging, such as creation and destruction and reincarnation after death. In addition, this period also brought about the belief in a form of supreme wisdom. This time period was also culturally defined by a series of Hindu hymns called Vedas, for which the period is actually named. The next section in Indian art is actually related to Buddhism. Buddhism primarily believed in achieving enlightenment, which ends the cycles that we just discussed of reincarnation, in which the individual achieves nirvana, which is the final cycle of death and rebirth, wherein their spirit becomes something larger than self, pain, or desire. Initially, Buddhism did not allow icons, but they were later welcomed for contemplative and meditative aids. Within Buddhism, there's also four main truths. The first is existence is suffering. The second is the cause of suffering is desire. Third, to eliminate suffering, one must eliminate desire. And fourth, to eliminate desire, one must follow the moral code of the Eightfold Path, which regulated speech, thought, and actions. Moving on to Buddhist architecture, we see the stupa, which is a dome-like structure that was created for Buddhist shrines, and the form itself actually evolved from burial mounds. In this graphic, we can see the difference between early and late Indian stupas, as well as Chinese and Japanese pagodas. While we see the distinct difference between the stupas and the pagodas, we can also see how time and location affected all of these different types of architecture. Looking at more sculptural Buddhist artwork, we see the depiction of the Bodhisattvas, which was actually a person who was on the verge of achieving enlightenment, who had nirvana within their reach, yet they delayed it in order to extend their time on earth and teach more people about Buddhism and their own personal journey toward enlightenment. These figures were often represented wearing rich garments and jewels, and they were further developed into the Gupta style, combining native Indian ways with sensual naturalism to create an idealized perfection. Next in India, we see Hindu art, and in Hinduism, there were three principal gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, who would actually intervene in human affairs to balance the cosmos. Shiva, who's actually depicted in this example, was often shown in architecture and sculpture. This is because Shiva encompasses the cyclical nature of time. Again, we're seeing a reverence for creation, destruction, recreation, all of those cycles that are throughout the universe. Another common theme in Hindu art is eroticism. It was seen as a natural part of humanity, and it was not created with the intention of being pornographic. By the 16th century, much of India was actually conquered by Islamic Mughal rulers, and as a result, artists were influenced by Islamic techniques as they continued on with their Hindu subject matters. Next, we see the formation of the Basoli style, which was primarily characterized by bright, vibrant colors, stylized faces that were often shown in profile, and a large eye, all of which we can see in this example here. Moving on to Southeast Asia, their Bronze Age actually began in 800 BCE when the metal was first imported into the region. The areas on the eastern coast, which make up most of today's Vietnam, were influenced by China, whereas the surrounding areas adopted a lot of Indian influences. Throughout Southeast Asia, we see a continued spread of Buddhism and Hinduism. Around this same time, we also see the development of the Borobudur, which we see pictured here. It's an elaborate version of an Indian stupa, and it contains more than 10 miles of relief sculptures that all tell stories of enlightenment. The corridors inside are also lined with sculptures depicting Buddha. Another architectural development we see in about the 12th century is Angkor Wat, which is a Cambodian temple inspired by the Borobudur, which itself was filled with stone bodhisattvas and Buddhas, in addition to low-relief sculptures depicting Hindu myths about Vishnu. Here we also see the common theme of naturalism and the environment as it's being worked into architecture. Originally, this structure was surrounded by moats, which were intended to honor the irrigation methods mastered by the Khmer people. There was also an emphasis on fertility within the design of the architecture, which can be seen in the tops of the towers as they are meant to resemble sprouting buds. Now moving on to Korean art, we're going to first look at ceramics. The techniques and styles were actually adapted from Chinese ceramics. However, the Koreans made a lot of innovations in their own right. So their lines were created by etching into the surface, which we can see in this example here. The willow, the bird, the other motifs, they're all etched into the vase. And they also designed by using slip inlay, which was actually developed specifically in Korea. This process involved white and black slip being painted onto the surface of the vessel before it was fired for the final time. Here we see the Lotus Sutra, which was actually an illustrated manuscript of sacred Buddhist scripture. It was revered by many as Buddha's final teachings. So far as the formal elements, it utilized gold and silver on indigo-dyed mulberry paper. This work also exemplified the integration of Chinese and Japanese influences, along with the Korean techniques of using fine strands of gold and silver, and it blended a mix of Buddhist and Hindu styles. Blending all of these influences, we see an emergence of a style that is totally unique in itself. Next, we're going to talk about China, starting with ancient art. So the Chinese believed that their ancestors lived eternally in the spirit realm, and they influenced the earthly realm for better or for worse. Using bronze vessels, like the one we see pictured here, people would often perform rituals in order to honor their ancestors. And this reverence for the past actually helped to evolve into Confucianism, which is a moral and ethical system developed by Confucius. We can trace these influences into the Confucianist idea of reverence for the past, ancestors, and for parents. Within these bronze vessels, we see a common motif of the Tao Tie mask, which was a composite monster made up of a mix of wings, claws, and horns. Unfortunately, the meaning is lost to us now, but it actually appears on many bronze vessels throughout this time period. In ancient China, many people were buried with their possessions, such that they could access them in the afterlife. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who was actually the first emperor of China, died in 210 BCE. Before he died, he commissioned to have an army of 6,000 life-size terracotta warriors buried with him in order to protect him in the afterlife. We can actually see these in the top left photo. Next we see the Han Dynasty, which was running contemporary to the Roman Empire, although it was much larger. Most of the art during this period was actually recovered from grave sites. According to the Chinese philosophy of Taoism, the best life is lived in harmony with creation. If this harmony is achieved, one becomes immortal. Within this thought, there is also the qi, which is the inner life force of a living organism. And art during this time focused on capturing this qi, rather than focusing just on drawing physical details. Moving on to Chinese painting, we see that two major components of the subject matter included landscape and calligraphy. Oftentimes, the paintings themselves even included poems. These two art forms were combined because they both had expressive, elegant brushstrokes, and they used ink as a medium. So formally, it makes perfect sense that they would go together. So while Chinese painting focused on landscapes, they never actually depicted a specific place. Rather, they captured nature's energy. The paintings that originated in the North Song dynasty were monumental and philosophical in their tone. Yet, in 1125, when the Mongol invasion happened, the courts and art academies relocated in the south. And with this change in location, there was also a change in style. It became more intimate and personal. Looking specifically at Fan Quan, who was actually a great landscape painter of the Northern Song dynasty, his artwork emphasized the power of nature. So again, we're seeing monumental scale, especially when compared to the humans in the compositions. There's also a sense of atmosphere, high contrast, and a central composition. So Fan Quan, the artist we just looked at, was actually from the north, the previous Song dynasty, and now we're going to look at Ma Yuan, who is in the later southern Song dynasty. Nicknamed One Corner Ma, this artist utilized asymmetrical compositions, so taking up the one corner, with large bits of negative space in the other areas. These features actually became characteristic of this new style in the south. So in the Yuan dynasty, Mongols took over China. So the artists who had previously been serving their own government and their own art academies did not want to serve under a foreign rule. As a result, they were not affiliated with the government or the academy, and they flaunted their amateur status, creating a new style that was less technical and controlled and more spontaneous, with different ink saturations in their brushwork. Meaning sometimes they would have barely any ink and have a very dry brush, and other times they would have a really dark, saturated, inked up brush. These artists created what was called literati painting. Looking still at Chinese painting, we see the hand scroll, which is a long painting on paper. You can view it by scrolling left to right, and it allowed for long narrations that couldn't fit within one composition. Instead, viewers would be able to scroll forward or backwards looking at different pieces of the narrative. Throughout the history of Chinese painting, it was very common for artists to copy the works of masters, sometimes just to learn more about the process, and other times adding their own personal variations. This practice of looking to the past just reiterated the Confucianist respect for those who came before. During the Qing dynasty, foreign rulers persecuted the descendants of the Ming. Artists dealt with this by responding to it in their work. This example here utilizes the cicada for its symbology. In Chinese mythology, it represents rebirth. So here, the artist is actually representing the hope for resurrection of the failed Ming. We can also see how the brushstrokes are much more expressive, with different levels of ink saturation on the brush, creating different values with the same ink. The final medium for traditional Chinese art is ceramics, which was able to advance technologically due to imperial sponsorship. One such innovation included the development of porcelain. Chinese makers noticed that when you struck porcelain, it actually made a ringing noise, so it was concluded that the best dishes contained music. As I'm sure many of us recognize, porcelain was often decorated in blue, and this is because blue was the only color that could withstand the high firing temperature required for porcelain. By the 15th century, Ming Dynasty potters discovered that they could glaze in any color, not just blue, by using multiple firings. The next region we're going to look at is Japan. Indigenous Japanese people believed in the Shinto religion, which was really focused on nature and ancestor worship. These people thought that the gods dwelled in forests, fields, waterfalls, and huge stones. And as a result, the architecture during this time was designed around these concerns. The shrines at Ise were built and are actually rebuilt every 20 years in a sacred forest location. The wood that is harvested for this building and rebuilding is done so in a ceremony of care and gratitude, as the community comes together to make the building exactly as it was, just new. Instead of using nails during construction, the wood is instead fit together or secured using pegs. Once completed, again to honor nature, no paint is applied. Instead, it's just the natural wood. The construction relies on refined craftsmanship and spatial harmonies, with an aesthetic that is simple and subtle, all of which we see in this bottom photo of the main shrine. Moving forward, we see the changes brought about by Emperor Shotoku sending emissaries to China. When the emissaries returned, they brought with them cultural elements from China. As a result, Buddhism became the official religion, and the emperor actually encouraged the aristocracy to learn and use Chinese script. In addition, there was a rise in Confucianist ideals like social order and respect for tradition. Within architecture specifically, we see the pagoda, which is a many-storied Buddhist temple, in addition to the kondo, which is a golden hall for meditation, in which many Buddha statues are kept. However, despite all of these Chinese influences, the Japanese were able to diverge and make their own styles. They instead focused on asymmetry, casualness, humility, and nature. They utilized an integration of natural elements. For instance, they used screen doors to connect the interior spaces with the exterior spaces. and much of their architecture began to use post and beam structures, wherein the beam bore most of the weight, not the wall, which allowed for movable screens to replace the wall because they didn't need to bear the weight. Again, showing this connection between the internal and the external, but also just allowing more versatility with space. Looking at Japanese sculptures from the Kamakura period, we see that they really favored realism. Unkei, who's one of the greatest sculptors of Japan, created this Kamakura example. This sculpture is a life-size, realistic depiction of a Buddhist priest from India. We can see he has a vivid expression and delicate gestures. All of these components that increase the naturalism of the figure push back against the hard stiffness of the wood that it was carved from, meaning that the figure looks more realistic than we would expect to come from a wooden object. Japanese painting also utilized the hand scroll for long narratives, and it was greatly influenced by Zen Buddhism, which came from China in the 13th century. It focused on meditation as a means of achieving enlightenment, which could come at any point in time. And Zen Buddhism influenced much of Japanese art, from poetry and gardening to calligraphy and paintings. The foremost Japanese master of ink painting, Sesshu Toyo, studied with the South Song masters in 1467. He even created his own style of, quote, flung ink called haboku, using abstraction, simplified forms, and brushwork. Splashed ink landscape, which we see here, is probably the most famous example of this technique. Japanese painting favored strong asymmetry, repeated patterns, rhythm, boldly simplified forms, especially in contrast to areas of high detail. Beyond examples of ink on paper like we just saw, the Japanese artists also painted on folding screens. Functionally, these screens created privacy by sectioning off areas of a single room. Whereas Western painters wanted to create a window into another world, these Japanese artists wanted to create something that was part of the space, both in function and design. Artists would create these compositions that functioned both as individual panels and as one larger combined layout. Japanese printmaking really flourished in the mid-17th century in the city of Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. They primarily used woodcuts adapted from the Chinese. These prints, titled ukiyo-e, actually lasted 200 years with hundreds of thousands of prints being made. The term itself, ukiyo-e, means the floating world, because these prints depicted daily life, like landscapes, popular entertainment, and portraits of actors. Oftentimes, they were characterized by bold curving outlines with very clear flat shapes that didn't really use a lot of shading. The composition was also not centered around the subject like it was in the West, but used a radical sense of cropping like we see in this example. In the 19th century, European commerce and missionary work started to impact Asia. Different regions responded to this influence in different ways. India submitted both willingly and unwillingly to the colonial rule of the British. China tried to strongly resist the influence of the West, but this actually led to a lot of conflict even into the 20th century. Japan fell to Commodore Perry in 1854, but they restored rule to the emperor in 1868. This print shown below illustrates some of the bloody revolt that actually restored the emperor to power. The print to the right, made by the same artist, actually shows how his work evolved after the revolt. Now I want to introduce you to some contemporary Asian artists. As usual, these descriptions are going to be very brief, so please feel free to do more research if you want to learn more about these individual artists. Here we see an installation work by an Indian sculptor and installation artist who works with text and sound. Her work examines cultural identity as it relates to personal perception. Next we have a Japanese multimedia artist working in printmaking, sculpture, painting, ceramics, and installation. While most of his subjects are very cute little children or animals, they often have a very sinister tone to them. Next we have a Chinese glass, ceramic, and installation artist. Her work is focused on the environmental concerns, often including found objects like plastic bags. Next we have a Chinese multimedia artist working in sculpture, photo, public art, and installation. He's also a human rights activist, responding to political, cultural, and social issues. This artist is Vietnamese American, working in photography, video, and installation. His artwork looks at Vietnamese culture and history. This is an Indian artist working with cut paper and installation. To create these sculptures, the artist has to use geometry, engineering, and architecture as it relates to paper. Next, we have an Indian sculptor and installation artist who works with found objects that she either arranges or alters to create her works. Next, we have a Filipino sculptor and installation artist who uses primarily recycled plastic items. Some of his work is wearable, where others create more of an environment. This is a South Korean installation artist and sculptor. The artwork here investigates displacement using found objects and sensory elements like scent and sound. This Chinese oil painter primarily uses photorealism and symbolism. Her work deals with her identity as a female immigrant in America. This Chinese artist uses gunpowder and other explosives to create performances, sculptures, and drawings. While some of his works directly use gunpowder, others are merely inspired by explosions. This Japanese multimedia artist, working in digital, painting, installation, and street art, as a true pop artist, she uses bright colors, bold outlines, and appropriated imagery, borrowing both from popular culture and art history. This Chinese painter and drawer conceptually deals with human connections and relationships. She uses traditional Chinese media of ink on silk for her contemporary styles and concepts. This Japanese artist is a painter, sculptor, digital artist, and animator. He works primarily with pop art using bright colors, bold outlines, and a cartoony style, which actually reflects his 1990 theory Superflat. He blends art and commerce, and unlike the West, does not distinguish between high and low art. Famously, he has collaborated with Louis Vuitton, Crocs, Kanye West, Pharrell Williams, Supreme, and more. For this lecture, I think an important so what is tracking the connections between art history and contemporary art now. We can see connections between formal qualities, like comparing Murakami's Superflat that we just mentioned, with Japanese woodcuts that have a similar aesthetic. Or we could look at techniques. For instance, Jingshu Yang uses traditional Chinese techniques in a contemporary setting. Or even artists like Tomoko Nagao who are directly using source material from art history. Artists are often heavily shaped by their culture, which in turn is shaped by its history. And all of these different connections helps us to understand art across time periods and regions in a better way. And with that, I am concluding my lecture. So make sure you guys get enough sleep, stay safe, and I will see you in class.